for those of you who don't know me, I'm Thorough. I am a nutritional scientist and researcher specializing in breast cancer. Went to medical school first, but I'm also an integrative oncology practitioner. And alongside all of you, I'm a breast cancer thriver. I've had breast cancer 3 times so far, and hopefully that's the end of that. All on the right side. And I was 29 the first time I was diagnosed. My master's thesis, so when I left medicine, I had a bit of a break and then I went and did my master's in nutritional medicine, specializing in cancer. I actually didn't finish my thesis until after I'd had breast cancer because I was diagnosed at the end of that course. Um, so I wrote my thesis on the kind of diet and lifestyle that can reduce the risk of cancer recurrence, and that's essentially my ongoing life's work. And I'm trained in integrative and functional medicine, and I'm a genomics practitioner. I'm going to touch on that today. And I'm also do loads of academic research, and I see patients privately along with doing health inequalities work. So today, oh, it's like hiding. I'm going to just move this over, see if that works. Okay, so breast cancer, is it a metabolic disease or environmental links? All this time, many of us were taught and we understood breast cancer or all cancers as being a genetic disease. But when you look at the stats and the data, only 5 to 10% of breast cancer diagnoses are actually genetic. There's also another 20%, up to 20% of cases which are familial, meaning that they affect families, but they don't have any of the known genes. And I'm from one of those families. So my mum, my mum's sister, loads of my mum's cousins, one of my own cousins have had breast cancer, but yet we don't have any of the known genes. And most of the people have had the same type of breast cancer in the right side. Now, left-sided breast cancer is a little bit more common. So I find that absolutely fascinating. So maybe there's going to be a gene mutation that comes up. What I do know from having done genomics testing is that both my parents have estrogen receptor 1 mutations, and I'm not going to go into that massive detail today because that's not the point of today's talk, but that could be another talk. But and I should just do these a little bit more regularly and not just once in a while. But if you're interested, then I will definitely do a talk on that. And so there could be a reason why, even though we haven't got any of the known genes, but we have an estrogen receptor mutation, that I was diagnosed with breast cancer quite early, despite not having a lot of the risk factors, the modifiable risk factors. As in, I've never smoked, haven't really taken the pill. I was very lean, lots of things. So there is that to think about. But today we're going to be talking about metabolic health and environmental links. And I'm going to kind of share a bit more, and obviously we'll have a little Q&A at the end. I have loads of information, but I want to kind of just share the basics so you can start to understand things that you might want to think about or look at, because these are things that traditionally are not covered when it comes to our conventional breast cancer care. And as an integrative person, I'm really interested in not just the physical, the emotional, mental, but also what's happening in our environment. What are other things that could impact our breast cancer risk? So what is metabolic health? Metabolic health is actually how our body uses fuel. And it can use actually different types of fuel, not just glucose. It can also use fats, it can use ketones. And what we really want is for our bodies to be as flexible as possible. So you can fast if there's no food and you don't feel hungry. You can eat when there's food, but you don't store it as fat. And that's essentially what we want our bodies to do. Now, in this modern world, our metabolic health, particularly in the UK and the US, is actually quite poor. And lots of us have issues with our blood glucose levels. We have high triglyceride fat levels. We have high HDL cholesterol. We might have high blood pressure. And we also might have a high waist circumference, meaning a lot of fat around our midline area. And if we have increased numbers for all of these, markers for all of these, then we're more likely to have something called a metabolic syndrome. So you need, and I'll share a little bit more about the numbers, but really things like your blood pressure being over 130 over 85 regularly, your blood cholesterol, these are actually some of the American numbers, but like your waist circumference being higher than 35 inches, but that actually changes for different ethnicities. So we will share a little bit more about that. But if you do have this metabolic syndrome, you've got a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, higher risk of type 2 diabetes, and a greater risk of stroke. Now we are going to talk a little bit more about this risk of increased risk of breast cancer, which is linked to type 2 diabetes, because it's something that we don't talk about in our medical system and we actually have lots of data on. So the other thing we touched on, I did a talk last week about metabolic health and the link with mitochondria. So I just wanted to share a little bit of mitochondria before we go on, because there is a little bit of a link. And mitochondria are cellular powerhouses. They're actually are essentially our cell's battery pack, and they are the ones that make energy from our food, whatever the food might be, and they're really important for our metabolism, cell signaling, all sorts of different things. Now, when we age, our mitochondria, these little battery packs, don't work quite so well, and particularly in the tissues which have lots of them, like liver and muscle. And so that basically changes our glucose on our fat metabolism. And that can impact our metabolic health because we're not making as much energy, we're not as efficient, we have a lot more energy that's been made not in a clean fashion, because normally we make ATP, our kind of cells energy, in a very clean way without lots of reactive oxygen species. That reactive oxygen species are essentially little molecules that can damage our DNA, and also damage the rest of our cell. And we also metabolize our fats and our glucose not very well as we get older. So this also impacts our metabolic health. And as we know, breast cancer, does the risk of it increases with age. The two things that are quite important for breast cancer generally are age and being a woman. Now, for some of us, many of us here who are on my talk today and who will be joining in the recording, have been diagnosed with breast cancer actually early. And anyone that's been diagnosed between 45 50, essentially it's early. So that's also something to remember. So what's going on there, and what can we do to support ourselves? So just going back to this metabolic flexibility. So we've always kind of just had these numbers, but a lot of those are based on the white population. But actually, we need to think about different ethnicities, and those numbers are slightly different. And I realize that this is in centimeters and the other one's in inches. But it's very confusing because, in Europe, we measure things in centimeters, yet our trousers and things are all in inches. And Americans measure things in inches. So a lot of the data is really mixed, which is not helpful. But anyway, let's just go to the centimeters. So if you're Central and South American, Chinese, Japanese, or South Asian, you're naturally smaller. And so your waist circumference, for you to be susceptible to metabolic syndrome or to these metabolic health issues, actually is smaller than somebody from a white population or even a Mediterranean or Middle Eastern. So for women, it's actually 80, so it has to be under 80. We want our waist circumference to be under 80 centimeters. For men, it's 90 to 94 if you're like Asian, and if you're Middle Eastern, it's 94. And then I'm gonna, don't worry, what I'll do is, Nick, I'll just close everyone and then that's the end of that. Um, and then if you're for sub-Saharan Africa, it's also 94. But if you're a European, Canada, Europe, United States, for men it's 102, for women it's 88. So you can see there's actually like a 10% difference. And that obviously, if we don't use data that's specific for our community or whichever community you're from, then it is going to impact your whether how susceptible, not just how susceptible, but how they're measuring your risk of metabolic syndrome, and whether you need to make a difference to your lifestyle and what you eat. So when it comes to cancer and our systemic metabolism, what we know is that there's a link with type 2 diabetes, inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistance. All of that contributes to cancer risk. So we know that some cancer patients or some high risk individuals often have insulin resistance. What does that mean? It means that when you eat a meal, you need to release, your body needs to release, your pancreas needs to release more insulin to basically manage the glucose that's been released from your food, and for your body to metabolize it, whether it's breaking it down, whether it's using it as fuel, whether it's using it as fat storage, or whatever it is. And that's not essentially good for us, because we don't really want high spikes in insulin all the time. We want it to be fairly kind of fluid. And I realize that you can't see my hand gestures, so I'm not going to show you that. But what we want is, if we keep having insulin resistance, it causes the body to produce even more insulin. And this high levels of insulin also are linked to high levels of insulin growth factor 1. If we have high levels of these two things all the time alongside some inflammation, then it creates ideal conditions for cancer cells to grow and to develop and grow out of control. And these hormones can tell cells to grow very, very quickly. And what they can also do is stop our internal cell death system. So basically, we have this internalized thing called cell death, and hold on, someone's coming. And basically, it switches off some of those signaling molecules, which tells our cells which are abnormal or they're damaged to die. The other thing is it can also, these high levels of insulin and high levels of insulin growth factor can also trigger inflammation, and that disrupts our cells further, so that it means that the cell growth can be growing not managed and not growing out of control. So it's something to think about. So obviously there is a genetic background to this too, and then we talked about these reactive oxygen species. So again, if there's a lot of metabolic kind of health syndrome, your mitochondria aren't working so well, you are going to have more of this reactive oxygen species, and you are more likely to have cell damage and DNA damage too. So what about our cancer cells? How are they different from normal cells? So if you look at the picture here, you'll see there's a blue, in the blue cell, that's the normal cell. The pink cell on the right, that is the cancer cell. So if you look at the bottom there, you'll see here, and I'll use the cursor, that a normal cell actually makes 30 to 36 ATP molecules. And we talked about that being our cellular energy. Whereas in the cancer cell, there's only two being made. So what's going on? There's a slightly different system. So because our metabolism isn't working quite so well in the cancer cell, it's making less energy, but it's actually making this very, very, very quickly. And it's kind of slightly dirty, and because we're having more oxygen, reactive oxygen species. And so something called the Warburg effect, which is why people keep talking about sugar and cancer. So cancer cells do use glucose differently than normal cells. Even when there's oxygen, they like to ferment sugar into lactate. So if you see here, they're making lactate. Here we make a little bit of lactate, we're making more ATP. So this is similar to what happens to your muscles when you're doing intense exercise. And this means that cancer cells can make quick energy and lots of raw materials to build new cells. And that's what cancer cells want. They want fuel to grow themselves, and they want all the material to make the cell membranes and the new kind of cell DNA. And then it also creates this more acidic environment, which weakens the immune cells trying to fight the cancer. So this is where two of the biggest cancer myths, or cancer, I want to say myths as such. There's obviously some grain of truth in it, but there's the kind of they've it's been oversimplified. So when people say, "Oh, sugar feeds cancer," this is where this comes from. And also when we talk about the alkaline diet, this is also where it comes from. However, it's not scientifically true in the way that the people describe it. And as much as the foods they recommend you eat are actually kind of nutritious and healthy, the science that they're trying to explain doesn't fully make sense. Although there's obviously some aspect of it which is true. But what we know is that cancer cells make up to 10 times more lactate. So that means that that's why they and we're trying to understand that as researchers. We don't know enough about this, and why is a cell, and until recently we didn't really understand much about this cancer cell metabolism, and that's why we thought it was very much a genetic disease. But now we're starting to understand there's definitely things like inflammation involved. We're starting to understand stress is involved. In fact, the World Cancer Research Fund, no, the IARC rather, which is part of the World Cancer Research Fund, actually funded some research in South Africa in breast cancer in women and looking at stress. And that's something that people poo-pooed until recently. I know that some doctors definitely say, oh, there's nothing to do with stress and nothing to do with what you eat. But what we're starting to understand is if you look at the cell biology and the cell physiology, actually they're little things which make people think things like cancer feeds sugar or alkaline diet is better because of the actual biochemistry that's happening with cancer cells. So just quick one with mitochondria. So we talked about our mitochondria being our little cellular energy pack, and you don't need to worry about all the things on this slide because it's super complex. But what I shared earlier was that they produce AT3 through this thing called oxidative phosphorylation, but they're really important as gatekeepers for this thing called programmed cell death. And basically, when cells are growing out of control, let's go back. When cells are growing out of control with this, basically all the signals that are required for this programmed cell death don't work anymore. And that's why the cells that can grow out of control. Whereas when they're working, it means any cells that are growing too fast, they can kill them. If the mitochondria are disrupted because there's DNA mutations or there's defects or the oncogenes, which are or tumor suppressor genes, and I talk more about this in other talks, this can lead to cancer cells growing. And just a little kind of reminder that these cancer cells prefer glycolysis, that's making this quick process rather than the normal process, just because they want their energy quickly. And so what we're starting to research and understand is how do genetic and metabolic changes have the mitochondria not work very well, and this also adds to how cancer develops and spreads. And that's something we didn't really know much about until recently. So how's inflammation involved and this microenvironment of the cell? So we know that if there's poor glycemic control and metabolic syndrome, so that's when we're talking about when there's too much insulin release, or when you find it hard to control your blood glucose, or you have any of the metabolic syndrome, things like the high blood pressure and the high cholesterol and the high triglycerides that we talked about earlier, it can lead to this constant low level inflammation throughout our body. And that can create an environment where it's easier for cancer cells to grow. So I think the best analogy that I've used, and I've used it here, is that this inflammation acts as both a fuel and fertilizer for cancer cells. And when you combine that with these high insulin levels, the conditions, our cells basically get the green light to just grow out of control, and they can grow too quickly, which means that cancer cells can spread or develop faster. What about stress? We just talked about stress, and we talked about this research that's happening in South Africa. So our body also reacts to internal and external stresses. To be really honest, a lot of our stress nowadays in the modern world is perceived stress. There's also glycemic dysregulation where our glucose isn't working well, but rather than actual stress. So we're not being chased by tigers anymore, but we are being chased by deadlines. We are being chased by financial pressures. We are being chased by all sorts of other things. And also sleep can really impact. So for example, when you don't sleep very well, which many of us might not sleep through midlife, through menopause, through cancer treatment, through whatever, new mums, new parents, that changes our hunger and our satiety signaling. So leptin and ghrelin, there are hunger and satiety hormones, they're disrupted when we haven't had enough sleep. And it does mean that we are more likely to crave sugary, fatty foods because to satiate these signals. So that can also be a body stress. But if you look at these four different things and different types of stress, there's a circadian disruption. So we have sleep issues. It could be that you have some sort of sleep apnea, or maybe you've had too much caffeine, maybe you're in pain, and or shift work or jet lag, any of these things that can all disrupt our circadian rhythms and our sleep. And we know that our circadian rhythms, and I do talk about this in other areas, are really important for our metabolism and our kind of cell kind of body clock to work well. And then when you think about kind of inflammatory signals, it could be diseases or allergies, cardiovascular health, GI issues, or not having, doing low physical activity. And all of those things can release these interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, TNF alpha. These are all molecules that are signaling molecules that can be disrupted and cause inflammation. And then glycemic regulation. So if you're having low fiber meals, that can impact. If you're having high GI meals, what does that mean? That means your blood glucose is being released really, really quickly. If you have insulin resistance, you're obese, you have low physical activity, meal timing as well, because if you're eating late in the evening, some of us have mutations, meaning that if we eat too close to bedtime, our insulin is released, and it actually doesn't help us to sleep because it actually blocks melatonin, our sleep hormone. So that's something else to think about. And then also these neurotransmitters. If we have this perceived stress, then of course we have different things like cortisol and adrenaline running around our system, and that can impact us. So when you think about chronic stress, this is when we've got this low level of stress all the time, which so many of us have. And it's really linked to us having higher levels of adrenaline and cortisol, which kind of trigger these inflammatory responses. But if you have a look at this particular cell, this has actually got the American names in it, but norepinephrine and epinephrine are basically noradrenaline and adrenaline. All of these increase, cortisol, prolactin, oxytocin, all increase when we're stressed. And dopamine, our reward hormone, actually decreases. And what does that do? It impacts a lot of the cell signaling. So it impacts DNA damage, increases that. It means our chromosomes are less stable, increases the risk, a lot of factors and cell signaling molecules, which can help our blood vessels to grow for the cells, cancer cells to grow out of control. It can change our metabolism within our cells. It increases this glycolysis, which we know cancer cells like. It can also increase lipid synthesis, which is really important for making cell membranes for the cancer cells to kind of stay alive. Again, it can help our immune system to for the cancer cells to evade our immune system, because we do have something like our immune system. If you think about like a CCTV camera system, it's constantly looking after us. It's constantly looking to see if there's any cells growing control. But basically, when they're cancer cells, sometimes what they can do is they can release signaling molecules which kind of block our immune system and can block the CCTV camera system from looking at what's going on, and so on and so forth. And we're learning a lot more about this cell proliferation, and particularly this AMPK. And kind of understanding what the link is that in our metabolism, but also then if we're eating things like a low carb diet or a keto diet, that impacts this AMPK signaling pathway, and that can actually be one way potentially of us reducing our kind of risk of cancer cells growing out of control. So now we're going to move to the environment, which is a bit of a shift. But what's really interesting is when we talk about the environment, and I'll share a little bit more, there are definitely things that are happening in our modern day lifestyle, which is impacting our inflammation. It's impacting our weight. It's impacting whether we're holding on to estrogen in our bodies. And that's why it kind of worked well to share a little bit more about that here. So our environment is super important for our health, but unfortunately, the last 150 years, it's changed completely from the previous 10,000 years that we humans lived on planet Earth. And sadly, in the 21st century, our environment is quite polluted. We're surrounded by hundreds of thousands of synthetic chemicals that we've only been created since the Industrial Revolution. Some of these really only since the Second World War. So we don't really understand the long-term necessarily impact of them. We hadn't understood, but now we're starting to see. And there's charities like Breast Cancer UK, which really focus on the environmental aspects of breast cancer and understanding more. And I was at their conference this year, and every year it's just endlessly fascinating. People are sharing their research, and this year actually they did share. They're the ones who shared about the stress, and I just wish that we would look more at environmental causes, because there is loads of information and data, and this isn't to frighten you, but there's obviously things that we can all do. But we're going to look at water pollution, air pollution, and soil contamination. I'm not going to go into organic food and pesticides as much this time, because we just don't have time, but it's something I've talked about before. But let me share a little bit more about these other types of pollution. Oops, wrong slide. So just going back to this, I will go back to physical activity. It should have been a bit further up, but quickly, basically, just to remind you that your metabolic health and your metabolism are impacted by exercise, and what both the US and the UK recommendations are at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity. And there is a scale to measure this. And on the rate of perceived exertion, that is looking at kind of, if you're doing moderate, it's like 5, 6. And if you're doing vigorous, it's over 7. But we do want to always include strength training. If you're South Asian, interestingly, because of our metabolic health and the fact that we have epigenetic changes, meaning that over lots of years, our bodies have changed to adapt to fat starvation. And that's a whole other talk that I did last week. We do need more exercise, and that looks like it could be 230 minutes, but it looks like it could be as much as 266 is needed for exactly the same impact on our bodies, on our metabolism. Anyway, and then obviously we've talked about the food before, but I'm not going to go into it as much today. So air pollution. So air pollution is not just gases, it's also solid particles, and it's very harmful to health. For anyone who lives in central London, you know that we have a measurement where they measure what the air pollution is, and we unfortunately sometimes reach the kind of maximum amount of allowed air pollution by January, which is ridiculous. And so that's why they've put in things like the ULEZ, which is the area around London, which where you're not allowed to have highly polluting vehicles. But what's interesting is that a lot of the air pollution comes from the building industry, and you know that in London there's so much building work happening all the time that there's something that needs to be done there too. So the sources of air pollution, industry, obviously car emissions, we talked about house and farming chemicals, deforestation, which is less common in the UK, but and smoking, and whether it's forest fires too. And there are all these different types of chemicals. And one of the really interesting talks in that the Breast Cancer UK conference this year was about small, tiny black carbon molecules. And what we're understanding is that that can be a risk factor for breast cancer. And actually, some of these things that the mayor and other organizations are doing to try and reduce air pollution in the UK, it's actually going to make a massive difference to reducing the risk of breast cancer, and also obviously things like asthma and stuff too. Oops. So when we talk about soil contamination, there's obviously all sorts of different things in the soil. Some of them are natural, some of them are things that we've added. Um, Obviously, the biggest risk factors come from kind of former industrial sites and obviously where people live. As humans, we're horrible. We keep pouring stuff into our soil. Um, and this can obviously harm us, plants, animals, and it's not good for us. So I'm just want to, I like this because it's such a visual representation. So obviously there's coal burning, and I know that we're trying to have more renewable energy, but we still rely on coal burning in the UK and the US, which is really problematic. Obviously, the use of pesticides and herbicide, fungicides, because all of that goes into our water table, and that can build up. Obviously, not just in our the oceans and rivers. We do have particularly polluted rivers in the UK, but also into the soil. And some of these chemicals and this effluent can actually leave chemicals, and then animal manure, mining activity, all of atmospheric pollution from cars and petrol and things like that. So there's a lot of potential. Obviously, we don't have any volcanoes in the UK, but do you remember when all the air traffic control got shut down? When there was that big volcano in Iceland and there were no flights for like 10 days or something. So that could obviously contribute to something like that. And we can absorb some of these contaminants by breathing them, by eating food, like if you had carrots or something, not wash them properly, food growing in the soil, and then through our skin too. And then there's water pollution. I mean, when I found this out, I was absolutely shocked that 80% of the world's wastewater is dumped and hardly untreated back into the environment. And this explains why the UK rivers, lakes, and oceans I mean, we don't have any oceans, but well, we do, but are so filthy. And I find it absolutely ridiculous that Thames Water continues to make money, pay their shareholders and their executives millions of pounds, and yet they don't treat the water, and it's very frustrating. But we know that unsafe water kills more people than each year than war and all other forms of violence combined, which is insane. So think about the countries where they have cholera and water's not treated. And in fact, I go to Mexico every year, and I always get sick the first week, and then I'm fine again. And that's probably because the water is not as clean. I'm using tap water to brush my teeth, and maybe I should use bottled water for the first week until I kind of adjust to it. And we know that drinkable water is finite. Only 1% of the world's earth water, fresh water, is actually that we can drink. So we have some problems. In 25 years, we're going to have a real problem. And we have to campaign, all of us, I think, to ask for better water. So the types of groundwater pollution, there's groundwater, surface water, ocean water, and point source, which is where it comes out. And then obviously there's agriculture, sewage, wastewater, and oil and radioactive substances. So how does that link to breast cancer? So a lot of these chemicals, these industrialized chemicals that we've kind of only started to be in contact with for the last 150 years or much less, really since the Second World War, um, they're actually types of estrogen, or they're estrogen mimicking things called xenoestrogens. And if we're constantly exposed to these in the air, the water, surface, it changes our body's detoxification processes and ability to clear estrogen. Now, if we end up with a lot of estrogen in our bodies, which so many of us do, we have estrogen dominance, then obviously that can impact us with PCOS, endometriosis, breast cancer, and it's not something that is naturally talked about in lots of breast cancer clinics or in risk factors. So it's really important for us to minimize our environmental estrogen. And there's also a link to potentially things like our weight and how much we hold on to toxic substances into our body. And all of this is really interesting because if you ever did your genomic testing, you can understand a little bit more about your body's ability to detoxify. So first of all, we have amazing organs like our liver, our skin, all of these things which detoxify. But sometimes some of us need more help because we have mutations in the enzymes and the genes that help to detoxify us. So for me, I know that I'm just more susceptible, me and my mum actually, are more susceptible to environmental pollutants, particularly things in the soil and herbicides, pesticides, all of those sorts of things. But some of these other chemicals too. And so it's very interesting because I've obviously transformed everything so that I use very little plastic. And my mum uses all the things because she's in her 70s and she's just hasn't got it, even though I talk about it all the time, and she hasn't understood her genomics. And obviously she's fine. She had breast cancer in 1999 and she's absolutely fine. And part of it's, I think, because she's um quite lean and she does a lot of exercise, so she probably sweats it a lot off. And sweating's so important, and that's why things like sauna can be really, really important to help us detoxify because our skin's such a big area of detoxification. And so it's definitely something to recommend because that hormetic stress is really, really good for us. So, what are these environmental estrogens? So, we want to kind of avoid plastics, particularly when they're exposed to heat. So, like if you ever get Deliveroo or whatever it is, sometimes it comes in those plastic containers. Although more and more of the companies I've noticed are sending them in cardboard containers or kind of like biodegradable stuff, which I think is fantastic. But obviously, a lot of things are still sold in plastic. Obviously, some things you can't avoid it. I bought some beetroot the other day, and I love pickled beetroot, and that often comes in plastic. But then I just eat it very quickly or I decant it into another container once I've bought it. And you can't worry about everything, but it's about trying to think where you can. So, for example, with water bottles, I definitely only use a glass or a metal one rather than plastic. So things like that. Nail varnish and nail varnish. Unfortunately, nail varnish is one of the kind of a lot of chemicals, and particularly we don't even understand as much about some of these gel ones. And in fact, there was some research that came out I think it was about 6 or 8 weeks ago, about kind of gel nail polish and the link to breast cancer. And Dr. Liz O'Riordan obviously was going on about it, saying she's still going to wear nail varnish. And I was like, great, that's good for you. But for me, that's something that for the last maybe 12 years, I've tried to find low toxic versions of nail varnish, and I'm not going to have gel nails because I just think I don't need to do that. Things like fabric softeners, again, loads of petrochemicals, most perfumes, but you can get loads of perfumes which are made with essential oils, surfactants in condoms and contraceptive gels. So you just need to look for ones without those things. New carpet and certain flooring, you can have that smell from new carpets, and smells of gases from copiers and printers and home use of all pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. So I got a second-hand oven the other day. So my oven's not working. All the new ovens are very fancy and they've all got Wi-Fi and things. And I didn't want to rush into choosing a new oven. And it's expensive. It's £1,000. And so I got a second-hand oven that hadn't been used much, which was very similar to my old one. Now, the problem is that the whole body of the oven was clean and it was all good. The roof, because they'd obviously done a lot of grilling, had of the oven is quite stinky and sticky. So I've been trying to find non-toxic ways of cleaning because I don't want to spray it. And my previous one had a self-cleaning mechanism where it heated itself really hot. So, there's always things to be looking at. So I'm constantly looking at things, and I'm never going to be perfect, but it's about just trying to do what we can. And I think that's important. So these plastics and estrogens, which we've talked about where they are, disposable things, toiletry bottles, all those things, they're often full of BPA, which is a weak synthetic estrogen. And it can be in can liners, in this paper receipts, all of those things. And it can disrupt our hormones by blocking or mimicking them because it is like this weak estrogen. So you can see from this receptor that the estrogen binding, that's the pink one, the pink round circle is the estrogen. So it just binds it in that receptor. But the xenoestrogen can kind of bind, but not fully bind because it's a slightly different shape and it can mimic. So we want to be careful of that and use glass, ceramic, and steel water bottles filled with filtered water rather than kind of plastic bottles. We want to avoid those carbonless cash receipts. We want to be careful of lined canned goods. I did have to do a bit of a kind of recce of these canned lined goods, and actually in the UK we seem to have a lot less of them. You'll know if it's lined because it's got a white lining. If it just looks like metal, then it's obviously just a can. And obviously don't cook in plastic containers or use roasting or sealing bags, and don't store food in plastic containers if possible. In the UK, mold is an issue. So I have had breast cancer 3 times. The second time, my first local reoccurrence, happened after I've been dealing with some black mold. So above my bedroom, there's a flat roof from a balcony from the flat above, and it had leaked. And I kept saying to the owners, "Can you do something about it?" And no one was really taking responsibility, either our kind of freeholders or the person that owned the flat before, and basically ended up growing black mold. And then I sort of, lived with that for a few months. And then kind of lost my temper and realized from the data and the research that black mold has a massive impact on us. And it can, if you have one of the genetic mutations, which means depending on how you detoxify mold, it can switch off your tumor suppressor genes. And so then if there are cancer cells, they will start to grow out of control. So I can't say it's obviously 100% that, but it was very linked to that because I didn't have nothing else had really changed. So we do need to be careful because we have this very damp climate. And we can have a lot of condensation that builds up in the windows. There's a lot of water vapor from the cooking, the showering, the breathing, all that sort of stuff, particularly with this double glazing, which keeps moisture inside. So what do we need to do? And obviously mold gives off these chemical substances, which can be quite toxic, and they can also give us low-grade inflammation, which we know from earlier slides, having low-grade inflammation all the time can disrupt our immune system and kind of have cells go out of control. So what do you want to do? You want to have good ventilation with windows open. You want to air your bed before making. I know everyone says, "Oh, you should make your bed in the first 10 minutes." No, you need to let it air because there's a lot of moisture in your bed, particularly if you're having hot flushes. You want to use extractor fans. You also have HEPA filters. I sleep with a HEPA filter in my bedroom. A dehumidifier even if you need to. But these things become very, very important to treat any damp and black mold as soon as possible because it can have an impact on your health and well-being. So our personal self-care products, these are all our toiletries essentially. And we know that a lot of these have got hormone disruptor chemicals. There are two particular groups of products which are being researched a bit more to understand if there's a link with breast cancer. Parabens, which many of you might have heard of, they're often used as preservatives. They're often, like, I think lots of people have talked about them in conjunction with deodorants, and other skin products, and they can actually penetrate the skin, and then they can have this weak estrogen activity. So we do need to understand more about the link, but for me, I just think if possible, let's avoid it. And loads of the brands are really good now at making paraben free. And when I first started cutting out parabens, which was 2001, so 20 something years ago, it was actually really hard to find products, and I was constantly looking for things and having to, like, try and get things from America and all sorts of places. So we're really lucky now that loads of the big brands have understood that. The other one is phthalates. The phthalates are really important for holding color and reducing brittleness in nail varnish and hairspray. They definitely are a hormone disruptor, and they can interact with estrogen and testosterone. So again, you want to look for these chemicals. I think you end up becoming a very, very, very good detective. There is an app which I saw the other day, which I've totally forgotten the name of, which I'll try and find, but when we send you this video. But it basically, you can, I think it's paid though, not a free one. Whereas Yucca is a free app for food, but it also does some products too. To kind of see whether there are any of these chemicals in your products. But I'm just a very avid reader of labels, which are very tiny these days, and it's obviously hard if you're buying things online because you can't really see. But that's definitely worth, like, and it's no point chucking everything away. Do not waste money. As you finish things up, then think and look, is there anything safer I can buy that's got less of these chemicals in it? So again, it's a whole job to tackle your environment, your home, where you live. What I have done is every time I finish something, I then look for something else. So if the one that was pretty hard because the cleaner was obsessed with using, I can't remember, Harpic, that was it. And then I had to spend ages looking because she kept saying, no, none of them work, none of them work. And then I have found Bauer Collective, and their toilet cleaner is really, really good. It's, it comes in pouches, and you have to refill the bottle. But, it's not like I did everything at once. I'm doing it bit by bit myself. Try and have a water filter. Unfortunately, our water does have chlorine. It does have fluoride in some areas. It has microplastics. So using a water filter system, I've just installed the Bear Grylls one. It doesn't do everything, but it does quite a lot of things like the chlorine, the fluoride, the microplastics, and it's relatively cheap. It's about 120 normally, but they're always offers. I bought it on a bog off offer and I made my neighbor buy one. So we ended up getting it for, I think, £70 each, which was great. You want to consider natural fibers for your mattresses, pillows, sheets, and wash them frequent, at least 60 degrees. And I think that's where people think, oh, we should wash it at lower heat. Yes, absolutely, for lots of environmental reasons. But then to kill the bugs and the bacteria and like anything that might be on there, you want to cook it for longer. You want to avoid non-stainless steel and Teflon pans. That's the non-stick pans, and then the nickel in jewelry and other products. So there's lots of things to think about, but it's about just trying with one thing. And I know that women often encounter 300 and something different chemicals before they've even left the house because of the amount of products that we use. So it's about simplifying and trying to reduce that, and that's going to take time. And there's definitely a way of like using things like bicarbonate of soda, vinegar, all sorts of things for cleaning products. So I really wanted to introduce it, and I really want to have more of a discussion today because this is really important for me, and to answer your questions. So for those of you who don't know much about me, I do see patients on a one-to-one basis using kind of the genomic and the nutritional medicine and functional medicine, and we generally people stick with me for 3 to 6 months because in that time frame they've normally learned as much as they need to implement it into their life. I also have a breast cancer course which I'm in the middle of updating, so that's available. It's an offer at £99. And I obviously do lots of academic research. And on that note, if there are any South Asians watching this, we do require some more South Asians who've had a breast cancer diagnosis in the last 5 years, who haven't really, especially if you've not been involved in research before. We're actually looking at weight management, and other aspects of breast cancer care, in those newly diagnosed, in particularly in South Asian, Black, and low income groups. And if there is anyone, you please take these details, and contact Amy if you just take a photo of this, and then you'll be reimbursed you for your time and for your travel, and you will get some of my food because I'm going to make the food for that one. So if you're interested, please do let me know. And that's it. And follow me on Instagram. I'm much more active there these days than I have been over the last few years. Trying to get a bit better. And you can always email me or contact me. So we're going to go and do some questions now. There we go. Let's see if there's any questions in the group. So yeah, Karen, water filters are generally plastic. So I'm not sure whether you're referring to the jug ones, but a lot of the ones that go fitted under the sink, they're actually often metal or some sort of lightweight metal. So it's worth looking at all the newer ones, and taking it from there. Now, does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have anything they want to ask me, anything you want to discuss? Because I wanted to make sure we had time for that today, because I realized that last time I talked for quite a long time. So I wanted to just, and we could, it could be nutrition questions or any sort of question. It doesn't have to be linked to these two particular topics. And you can just put your hand up, you can just talk. Yes, any tips for diet? So I haven't done that talk this year because I just do it all the time. So let me just answer Nick's tips. So first of all, what we know is that cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, all of those wonderful things, A in season right now, and dark leafy greens, they are your best friends. So the data shows from the World Cancer Research Fund that having 2 portions of dark leafy greens and 1 portion of cruciferous vegetables daily is very important. The cruciferous vegetables are incredibly important for detoxifying, and they're really good for binding to the use estrogen and use hormone metabolites and removing them from your body alongside fiber. We want to be having a high fiber diet. Now in the UK, we want to aim for 30 to 35 grams of fiber. Unfortunately, most of us are not even having 18 grams. So we really want to build that up. So how does that work? Eating a lot more fruits and vegetables, oats, whole grains, yeah, things like, even like the dark chocolate has a lot of fiber in it. I feel like I get a lot of my fiber from dark chocolate. Avocados, and making sure you have a fiber source in every single meal. But that's one thing. You want to be having, and obviously we go into a lot more detail, Nick, in the course, because I go through a lot of the information. But having more protein-rich foods, dairy is actually safe. What we know that is drinking milk itself is can increase your risk slightly, but fermented dairy is very protective. Having a high calcium diet, very protective. So that's eating your dark leafy greens, even things like sardines, or little things like sesames, nuts and seeds, very, very, very important for reducing your risk. In fact, I'm going to share a slide. I'm going to go back to that. Right, let's go back. Let's go back. I did have that slide briefly. This isn't cancer. This is just more of a healthy diet. Oh wait, where did it get stuck? Why did it go back? Sorry, it keeps getting stuck. Hold on a second. So this is a healthy plate. If you see, half the plate is fruits and vegetables. So we want to aim for 3 or more types of fruits and vegetables, have a different variety of color. We want to have healthy fat, so that includes like olive oil. Olive oil is really important. Even for Asian foods, we still want to have a little bit of olive oil in there, whether we use it for cooking. Olive oil is great because it doubles its volume when you heat it up, so you need less oil. Nuts, seeds, avocado are the healthy fats. Carbohydrates, we want to really go for those whole grain versions. Protein, we want to go for lean protein where possible, whether it's eggs, fish. Although the oily fish are very, very important. If you don't eat oily fish, you do want to be having an omega-3 supplement. And obviously, this is a very general thing. For each person, it's going to be slightly different depending on your genomics, depending on your lifestyle, depending on your culture, depending on what you like to eat. We want to avoid a red and processed meat, particularly grilled and barbecue with the char grills. Right now, all of you should be supplementing with vitamin D. We are not making it anymore because the angle of the sun is wrong. We're too high north, too far north to make vitamin D from October to April. So everyone should be supplementing. At least 80% of anyone that's diagnosed with cancer is deficient in vitamin D. And the NHS numbers for sufficiency are only 50 nanomole per liter, deciliter per liter. Optimal health is between 80 to 120. So you can see how the NHS levels aren't actually kind of right. They're just stopping from being insufficient rather than actually optimal. Limiting alcohol. So a glass of red wine. So actually, there's no safe amount of alcohol for unfortunately anymore. And for anyone linked with breast cancer, like really, alcohol's just not safe at all. It's a class 1 carcinogen. However, we all drink. I do. I drink once in a while, but I just limit it, and I drink a lot more. And also, I find that my body, particularly post radiotherapy, my liver hates alcohol. It's a very poor process, and I even if I had 1 or 2 glasses, I feel awful. So I just tend not to do that. But that's how it is. You want to be having more plant-based foods and more fermented foods, probiotics to really support your gut health. And that's why you want to have a lot of fiber. So much of our immune system is based through our gut health. So it's very, very important. We have a gut-brain axis too, so it supports our brain. We want to reduce free and refined sugar. Unprocessed soy products are actually safe to eat. So you're looking at things like tempeh, miso, edamame, tofu, things not so great. Soy milk and stuff, you can have it, but it's not it's not even that high in soy. But that processed soy, we're not entirely sure about. And what we've realized is there's something called estrobolome. So there are some gut bacteria which metabolize soy products. Some of us have them, some of us don't. So soy used to be contentious, but now we've realized that it's either beneficial or neutral because your body doesn't have the bacteria to manage it. And we want to keep hydrated too. So I'm going to stop sharing again. Right. Are there any beauty wellness brands that are clean that you recommend? So I was a big fan of Ren. Ren have shut down. So there are so many brands now, though, and it's worth kind of looking at. And I can't just recommend brands just because there's so many that I know not enough about all the different new brands that are coming up. But a lot of the brands that are shared, like on like beauty magazines and things like that, if you actually look at them, so many of them don't have the phthalates, so they don't have the parabens, but you have to kind of read the labeling and you have to go on their website and look at the ingredient list because I have to be honest, I've been such a big fan of some of the products I've used for a long, long time, like people like Ren, and now they've shut down over the last, literally, I think the last day was August. I just stocked up. So this is where you kind of need to look at it. But if you look at, I think there's a lot of brands Even if you go, whether you go to Superdrug, whether you go to Sephora, if you have a look, there's actually brands, all of them, which avoid phthalates and parabens and stuff. But it's worth looking at. See if there's any other questions. Okay. Anything else that anyone else wants to ask? Because we have 5 minutes, and I'm really happy to. And we did start a few minutes late as well. So, and you can shout out, or you can just put in the chat. I don't mind. Mm. Yes, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Toro Shah Integrative Health. And Willeda, yeah, Welleda's great. I like Welleda. They're fantastic. Sorry, I just couldn't think of any brands. My brain went kind of dead, so I apologize. So I was just like totally went brain dead. Yeah, Welleda's great. There's so many brands now, but I think it's worth looking out for them. Yeah, I do share stuff on Instagram. I'm a bit erratic with it just because there's a lot of things to do, and I'm like don't have a social media person. Videoing it is not my forte. But I do try and share things, particularly about risk factors and different, things that maybe not everyone else is talking about. So, yeah. Anything else anyone wants to share or discuss or ask me about? Can be anything linked to, well, within reason. Breast cancer nutrition. Tropics, yeah, Tropics. Helena, yeah, Tropics is actually quite good. It's actually, I've checked it, the ingredients, it's pretty clean. A lot of breast cancer people use Tropics. It's also well priced too. And apparently some of the Avon stuff is too. Not all of it, but apparently Avon, which I never really thought about that. There are so many brands now. I've definitely used Ilia for makeup. Um, and so Omega, do we need to test for omegas? You can't really test for the omegas necessarily. I don't know what you mean by omegas, or just stick to the guidelines. I'm not really sure what you mean. Carrie, I think, do you mean vitamin D?
Sorry, no, the omega 3s and like the if you're eating fish a couple of times a week and taking a supplement, should you be testing or is it okay
It's
just
actually very hard to test.
okay?
Yeah, it's not
Okay.
something that people test naturally. Or
Yeah,
and it's not something we do test. So again, it's very important for anti-inflammatory. Unfortunately, our oily fish, again, because of the pollution and the types and the water, it's not as high in nutrients as it used to be, particularly if it's farm salmon, and farm trout and things like that. So most people need to have the fish and supplement. And also, if you've done your genomic testing, which many of us have done, so many of us have pathways where there's disruption where having a more of an omega-3 will help it. It will help to reduce the inflammation. So for example, one of the things I've noticed is that as I've had tamoxifen and I've got slightly older, my eyesight was not doing it. And I was having a lot of watery eyes, which is really common in menopause and perimenopause. And I've been taking omega-7 and a little bit more omega-3, and that problem stopped now. So
that's
there's
really interesting. Thank
I've
you.
done an article. I've done an article on the eyes, the dry eyes, because I was having that problem. So a lot of things I talk about, I'm right about because I've had that problem. So I was like, why is this happening? And no, a lot of people don't tell you if you're having tamoxifen, letrozole, any of the air and AI inhibitors, that it can affect your eyesight. It's just that I happened to say something to the optician who was just quite interested, and we ended up having a conversation about it. And then I went back to like the breast nurse. I was like, oh, why do you not talk about this? So it's definitely things that we need to even answer. Even me as a researcher scientist, they're not, I'm not a specialist in eyes, and so that was really interesting to me.
That's great. Thank you.
You're
Thanks.
welcome. Has anyone got anything else they want to share or give anyone tips or ask me? So we've got 1 minute. But just like things like another thing I do, and I haven't talked about this. Obviously, there's so much I could talk about. So if you anyone works with me one-on-one, we do look at all of these things, but we look at things like your own metabolism. We look at kind of sleep. We look at stress management. We look at your environment, toxins. We look at your social health, even things like your circadian rhythms. So, for example, you can see I'm wearing these glasses. These are blue. They're not glasses for seeing. They're blue light blocking glasses because basically after sunset I try to have I don't have these normally have these lights on. I try and have it just like dim lighting and lamps on everywhere. And if I'm watching TV or if I'm using my computer, then I just use these blue looking glasses because I know that for me sleep's a real issue, and my sleep disruption is really impacted by using obviously blue light, whether it's the screens or TV or uplight. So For me, for most people, that's really impacts your sleep. So, and obviously in the summer it's slightly different because obviously it's light till a lot later. But in the winter, particularly when it's starting to get darker, like now, I'm trying to. I really kind of revert the light usage around sunset. So as soon as it sort of starts to get dark at the moment, it's what as early as six. I think 6:20 now. I think or 6:15. I kind of dim all the lights and I wear my blue light blocking glasses because all of these things can impact our breast cancer risk too. And what we know is from shift workers that anyone that's had a disrupted circadian rhythm that can impact your risk of breast cancer. So lots of things that we talk about both in if you're in the integrative oncology course, or you can have a free call with me for 30 minutes to understand how, I think what we do. So red light therapy is fantastic. Um, but it's not the opposite of blue. Like what it is really important for your mitochondria. And I think I touched on this on the metabolic health and mitochondria talk. But it's very important for wound healing. It's really important for healing all over. It helps to support your mitochondria and for them to work better. Um, I am going to go and have a red light therapy session tomorrow. I try and have one a week at the moment, just because there's been lots going on, and I think I've had COVID, and I've also just have a little wound at the moment, so I'm just having the red light therapy. And it also helps with stress management. It helps with pain relief. There's loads of really good data. And last week I did a talk for breast surgeons and plastic surgeons about wound healing and the nutrition to support wound healing. And we talked obviously a lot about different types of foods and things, but we also looked at hydration and we looked at red light therapy. I don't have a home unit. I actually go and to a place, and I go to this place called Biogena. There's a longevity lab where they have a full body um above and below red light, and it's fantastic. It's very relaxing, and I'm using that. And if you guys email me, then I'll share an invitation and a discount code to go there. It's on Regent Street, and it's just a nice place to go and do some stuff. So yeah, on that note, you've all got my details. We will send this video with a little I know I was going to send forgot what I was going to say, but I'll remember what it is. And please stay in touch. And I'm always doing talks like this. And if you've got any ideas of things that you'd like to hear from me, please let me know. Please drop me a line. Follow me on social media, Torshar in Integrative Health. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you soon. And meeting you in person, or for you attending another course. So I am doing a live event next on the 23rd. It's at Hello Beautiful, which is an amazing little breast cancer center, shop and center. It's near Holborn, and it's just a free event. You can sign up via my website or the Hello Beautiful website, and it's just going to be me talking about all aspects of integrative health and breast cancer. And we've got some fun goodie bags, and it'll give you a chance for you to meet me in person and to answer questions and to hear a little bit more about different aspects that we didn't cover today, including nutrition, obviously, and diet. So have a look out for that. And yeah, and please stay in touch, everyone. I'm wishing you a good evening. Go and dim all those lights. Make sure you have a nice, nutritious dinner. I'm going to have a little steak and broccoli, which is very boring, but I'm going to enjoy that. And a piece of some dark chocolate, because I always have dark chocolate. And it was really nice and thank you for joining me.